Yo guys, hope everybody's having a great day or evening. Before we jump in on the topic of the video, there's a few things I want to clarify. So first of all, I'll try to keep everything as concise as possible, but also at the same time, I'll be focusing on going pretty in-depth on the things I do talk about so you guys can soak up all of the knowledge and apply it in your own games. Second, everything I'm about to say is something I personally believe in, as in everything from runes to matchups and anything else I end up talking about, I've gained information on from my personal games. I've also done research on how other high elo players play Aurora, but I'll mostly comment on my success with her and the way I think she should be played. At the end of the day, there will be differences in some of the information since there's different playstyles even when we're talking about one character. But that's completely okay. Since the goal of the video will be to provide information for new Aurora players, but also more experienced ones, you can take what you think is useful for you and apply only that in your games. Lastly, just to give a bit of credentials to what I'm saying, last split I managed to get 1 KOP with Aurora being my second most played champion, and this split I'm currently sitting at 650 LP with Aurora being my most played by a mile. Yeah, you can kind of see I've transitioned to being an Aurora main. With all that out of the way, I hope you enjoy the video, and let's get started. So first of all, what type of champion is Aurora? Aurora is a ranged AP assassin with elements of a control mage. She excels at engaging and looking for picks throughout the mid to late game. Her main way of carrying games is throughout teamfights rather than split pushing. She can be played top, mid, and bot lane as an ADC. Maybe she can even work as a support in some specific cases, but honestly, she doesn't provide enough to be justified as one. Then, the next question we should ask is, why pick her over any other champion? Well, there's a few selling points for Aurora. Firstly, she's a lane neutralizer, meaning that she can stomp a good matchup or be okay in a bad matchup. That automatically makes her a great blind pick, and that makes her highly valuable the higher you go in ranked games. Secondly, she has insane impact once mastered. She can gain the lead from lane and completely take over the game with it. But even if she's behind, she can still be a threat if played correctly. And lastly, something that we should not take for granted is she's insanely fun and has a high skill ceiling. On top of being really strong, she also provides high skill expression combined with unlimited number of ways to play out certain situations. Of course, as any champion, she also has a few weaknesses. Unless you're Skarner, then you don't really have any. Aurora is really weak into champions they can control when they can all-in her. She has ways to deal with this, but once you're caught, it's generally hard to do anything. Examples of this are Kennen and Aurelia. Both champions can easily out-in you if you're not careful. The later the game goes, the stronger Aurora becomes, but also the more fragile she becomes. She's the true definition of a glass cannon. The other significant weakness she has is that she is a skill shot based champion. All of her damaging abilities are technically skill shots, even though one of them is pretty easy to hit. Sometimes you can end up messing up pretty badly and you might not end up achieving much due to missed skill shots. More on her abilities in a little bit. First of all, let's start with her runes. When it comes to runes, there's a variety you can end up choosing based on the matchup in game. To make it easier for everyone, I will have a link with a screenshot in the description down below of every page that I use with a name so you know which one to bring and where. The first and most used page will be the Electrocute one. Electrocute synergizes perfectly with Aurora's kit due to her trading patterns in lane, but also scales really good throughout the game since it gives you the extra damage you need to finish off targets in the mid and late game. The Domination tree is the best tree you can bring on Aurora if you can get away with it, since it has two really important runes in here, which are Sudden Impact and Ultimate Hunter. Both runes are non-negotiable if you're going this tree and you should always bring them, reason being Sudden Impact complements Aurora's damage even further with her mobile playstyle, and Ultimate Hunter lets you have your ult off cooldown even further, which is extremely helpful. For a secondary tree, it depends on who you're facing. If you don't know who due to flex picks or if you're just feeling confident into any matchup, go with Precision and then choose Presence of Mind and Cut Down. You always need 1 mana regeneration rune, so in this case Presence of Mind will be the one, just make sure you're making use of it during the laning phase. You might be asking, why Cut Down over Coop? And the reason is, you generally don't struggle killing low HP enemies, and also Cut Down is just a more universal rune. You can bring this page into any free matchup, such as Kayle, Camille, any tank matchup, or honestly anyone. But you will struggle with this page when you end up facing more skilled opponents due to there being better ones versus specific champions, and those are the ones we're gonna cover next. If you're facing a melee champion that can easily ult-in you and you still want to fight them back early game, you need to go resolve secondary with Bone Plating and Overgrowth. Remember earlier when I said you always want 1 mana rune? Well, this is the only time you could consider not to, but you absolutely need to rush Lost Chapter for your items to make up for this deficit. You bring this page specifically against Jax due to how his kit works and how you prefer fighting him. That said, you could also bring this page against Riven, but I found out that there's a better one that you can bring against her that I'll talk about later. The next page we're going to talk about is Aerie. Recently, this has been the go-to page for me on most matchups due to it giving me the extra trading power I need in some harder ones. You go Transcendence if you're facing champions that can gap close you easily, and Absolute Focus versus ones that can't. An example, Ambessa can easily gap close you, so you go Transcendence versus her. For a secondary tree, one of the options is, surprise surprise, the Domination tree with the 2 runes I mentioned earlier, Sudden Impact and Ultimate Hunter. You bring this versus champions like Ambessa and Gnar that you prioritize keeping distance and dish out burst combos using Sudden Impact. The next secondary tree you can bring is the one I was hinting at earlier against Riven, which is the Resolve one. Idea is you bring Bone Plating to survive early game, but this way you also get to keep mana flow banned and have a good lane presence because of it. The trade-off by not going Electrocute page is that your damage is weaker later on, but are stronger in lane. I think against Riven specifically, that's way more important since you want to make sure you put her as far behind as possible in lane and not give her a free ticket to 2 items. The last secondary page you can bring with Aerie is Precision. Same as before, you go Presence of Mind and Cut Down. In this case, you take 2 mana focus runes, and you want this versus champions that have energy or no secondary resource like Yone and Tryndamere, and can also take this versus any tank to fight their constant sustain from Doran Shield and Second Wind. Next up is the Comet tree. For a secondary one, you will always pair it with the Domination tree, due to it synergizing very good with the Comet playstyle. You use this versus champions that outrange you, like Heimer, Jace, or Kennen, but if we're talking about mid lane, things like Victor. Idea is you use your very strong 1 ability trading pattern, which is just using E to outtrade them without much counterplay for them. For top lane, you need this to survive hard lanes like Jace, but there's also another alternative that I'll mention next. And that alternative is going Grasp and combining it with the Precision or Sorcerer tree. I've only used this page a few games, and honestly I like it specifically against Jace due to the nature of that champion if he decides to go Conqueror and play really aggressive early levels. Using this tree, you can fight him back and win trades if you play it correctly. I personally prefer the Comet option though, due to the fact that Grasp doesn't do all that much later in the game, whereas Comet still gives you some extra damage. Moving on, next we're gonna cover itemization. For a starter item, you're always gonna start with Doran's Ring and try to keep it in your inventory as long as possible before eventually you're forced to sell it. For a first back, ideally you'd get either Lost Chapter or Hextech Alternator, but sometimes you'll settle for a lesser bag consisting of Dark Seal, Amplifying Tomes, Boots, and Refillable Potion. Any mixture of these components work, but try to spend all of your gold. Also, if you go for Liandry first, your preferred component will be Faded Ashes. Now onto something a bit controversial, which is what first item do I go on her? Depending on who you ask, it'll be a different answer. It's gonna be either Ludens, Malignance, or Liandry. All of these options have their appeal and are correct in certain cases. Ludens is the best overall item on her due to her assassin-like nature. Malignance enhances her teamfight and makes her have more presence throughout the game. Liandry fixes one big issue Aurora has, which is dealing with tanky enemies. The truth is, I personally build Ludens 90% of the time as a first item and Liandry 10% of the time. I completely disregard Malignance, and the reason is the way I see Aurora is not like I would see Lissandra for example. I see her as her own separate entity from her ult, and I think she is impactful without it. Obviously, Aurora wants to fight when her ult is up, but if you choose to go Malignance, you're 10 times weaker than when you don't have ult, thus making it practically impossible to have an impact when your ult is down. Also, Ludens is not straight up worse than Malignance when it comes to ult impact, since Ludens ends up giving you more damage in the actual fights, thus making it up for the less ults you would have throughout the game, and making Ludens, in my opinion, the better overall option in terms of consistency. So if that's the case, why even mention Malignance in the first place? Well, I think that if you're playing mid lane Aurora, Malignance has an actual place. Since as mid lane you're looking to have an early impact on the map, you could go this route and try to take control over the game by shoving waves and looking for constant roams with the low early cooldown you have on your ult. For the record though, I'm not a big fan of this route since I prefer the damage Ludens provides, but it's good to know what options you have and choose for yourself which item to go for. And as for Liandry, there's a few things that need to happen for me to even consider building it. 1. I'm facing at least 2 tanks. 2. Nobody on my team can build it, and 3. I'm solo AP, or a combination of these things. That said, Liandry can still be built secondary even if you choose to go either Ludens or Malignance as a first item. Actually, most of the time you wouldn't want to build it first, since you prefer having a meta item before that. The only time I don't mind building Liandry first is if I combine it with the Aerie Room page plus Precisions for Presence of Mind. This way you make up for the lack of a mana item. Next items depend on the game itself, and they will never be the same ones due to them being tied with the current AP items meta, who you're facing, and what your team comp is. Small disclaimer, the things I will cover next are true not only for Aurora, but probably most AP champions, and I'm sure some of you know these things, but I still want to cover them so people have a general guideline. If you're one of the main initiators and setups for your team fights in your team, and also you need to have your ult up more often, you want to build Horizon Focus. If you need to do damage to squishy champions, go for Storm Surge. But if in the game there's a combination between squishy and more tanky champions or bruiserish champions, go for Shadow Flame. If enemies have at least 2 tanks and nobody else is building Liandry, well, you should do it. And let's not forget your best option when it comes to making plays, Zhonya's Hourglass. It allows you to go in and not worry about dying in certain situations, also makes it a lot more playable when facing champions like Zed and Rengar. All of these items are viable for a second one or any item down the line and go very well together in the correct situation. And finally, let's cover a little bit more specific scenarios. If you're in the need for more damage, Rabadon's Dead Cap is your choice. Void Staff if they're stacking a lot of magic resist, Bloom if they're stacking some magic resist but you also want to get some extra ability haste, Banshee's Veil if they have one-hit catch abilities like Ashe ult or Vi ult, and if they have a lot of AP damage, Cosmic Drive if you want a lot of ability haste and enemies are mainly melee champions, aka long drawn out fights, and lastly, Aurora is also a good heal reduction champion since she has a decent amount of array of damage, so if you need to, you can go Oblivion Orb and then later on turn it into a Morello. As you can see, you have a lot of options to choose from and it comes down to experience to know which one to actually build. My best advice for this is to always make sure that no matter what you build, you know what your job in the current game is and make sure that you're actually doing it. Let me give you an example. So here's a screenshot of one of my recent games. As you can see in this game, I'm solo AP. Well, sometimes looks might go more AP-ish, but I consider myself the main source of magic damage. With that information, I know that I need to make sure that we always have sufficient damage to carry team fights, and if the enemy stack too much armor, I want to punish it and capitalize on it. Next thing that I notice is that the enemies are only bruisers and squishies. With that in mind, I don't need to worry about Liandry at all. The build I end up going for is this. Depending on how much of a threat the enemies considered me to be, I might have went for a Zhonya's, basically if they focused me more. Or if we couldn't finish off kills because the enemies are healing too much due to Sylas's W or Xinzao's passive healing, I could have went for an Oblivion Orb. Sometimes you have a lot of options and it's up to you to determine which ones you're gonna go for and play around them. Lastly, in terms of items, we will cover boots. Regarding them, the best most universal ones you can get are Sorcerer's Shoes or otherwise known as Magic Pen Boots, due to them being always good in basically any game. But as other things mentioned before in this list, in certain cases you'd rather go something else, such as Swifties if you're facing a specific matchups like Aatrox or Olaf, Symbiotic Souls if you want to be fast on the map, aka to match someone else like Gwen in terms of recalls, or if any game is really chaotic and your back timings are really scuffed around 600 gold, they're good to pick up and are pretty good on Aurora in general. Plated Steel Caps if enemies are AD heavy. These are the only boots I've ever bought on her. There could be an argument for other boots as well, but honestly the way Aurora is supposed to be played, I feel like these are the best options. Next thing to talk about will be her abilities. I'll quickly go over them, but if you're already familiar with her kit, you can skip to this timestamp to go to the more interesting and advanced things you need to know about Aurora's kit to utilize it to its full potential. Starting off with her passive, landing 3 separate auto-attacks or abilities on a target deals max HP magic damage. It also regenerates your HP over a small period based on your level and AP. Even though it deals max HP magic damage, compared to Liandry, it's not that much, so Aurora's actually not good against tanky enemies. It's her main source of constant DPS, together with a bit of burst, and it's the component that ties in all of Aurora's abilities together. Her Q ability throws a projectile in a line dealing damage to everyone in its path. Aurora can recast this ability to pull it from whoever you hit with it, dealing more damage to every target you've already hit, but also on everyone it passed through on the way back. The second part also deals damage based on the enemy's missing health. This ability is your main source of damage and you will max it first in most games. Her W lets you jump in a direction and turns you invisible halfway through the jump, also gaining movement speed when you land on the ground. It also resets on a kill or assist. You can jump over most small terrain with this ability. W is your main mechanism to set up situations for yourself or your team and make fancy plays. E deals damage in a straight line after a small cast time. It also slows down enemies and pushes you back a little bit. You can jump over very small terrain with E, such as the one in Dragon Pit. One very important fact is that this ability has no projectile unlike your Q, so it goes through Yasuo Windwall for example. When talking about max range, E travels faster due to being almost instant and no actual travel time, so against long range enemies or harder matchups, putting some extra points in it is very helpful. Lastly, her ult jumps in a direction and deals damage to everyone in a huge circle, slowing them down by a bit. Afterwards, it leaves an area in the same location in which every enemy that attempts to leave will be slowed down again, and this time by more. It also lets you travel from one side to the other by moving through the edges. With the initial jump, you can also jump over walls. Your ult is the bread and butter when it comes to doing anything. It's extremely important that you utilize it whenever it's off of cooldown, but it depends on you to find those opportunities. Now onto the more advanced portion when it comes to playmaking and understanding Aurora's kit. If you guys are enjoying the video so far, I strongly appreciate if you subscribe since I plan on making more educational Aurora guides such as covering matchups and meta changes. I also have a Discord with a community that anyone who wants to get help with League is welcome. Starting off, Aurora is a very strong early game champion. Look to abuse your passive as much as possible since that's how you outtrade almost anyone, even someone as strong as Vladimir. Just remember, hitting your skill shots is key, so look to hide them in between your auto attacks and make it hard for the enemies to dodge them.
Good lord, man. Does he kill me? Oh, man!
Next, as you saw in the video, I did the normal flash E. With Aurora, since both your E and Q have a cast time, you can choose when to flash with either one of them, which makes it generally hard for enemies to predict whether you're gonna actually do it. You can start casting your ability and not actually commit the flash, or if you notice that the enemy isn't reacting to the potential threat, then you can do it. You can also do either a slow or normal flash Q and combine it with E. This will be one of your main ways to catch people off guard and burst their HP down throughout the game.
Mais il joue trop comme un sauvage lui, genre Dos, t'es dans 8 CS mon frère. Quoi? Non, par contre, c'est vraiment une honte.
Or sometimes you can use the Q in one direction and E in another, baiting out the flash with the Q and throwing the E in another place where you think he'll flash. Another very important mechanic about Aurora's Q is the pullback. Similar to how Zarya's E works, after you hit enemies, you want to make use of the pullback as much as possible. Positioning yourself in a manner where you get the most value out of it is key, since it actually does a surprising amount of damage, especially later on into the game. And lastly, regarding Aurora's Q, you need to make use of the missing HP damage. Look to hold it until the last possible moment to min-max, so for instance, if you can proc Electrocute with other abilities and attacks before pulling the second part of the Q, it will give you some extra damage, and in some cases it can be crucial. Also, holding the Q as much as possible is not only for that, but it extends your passive duration, so keeping it on them will make it annoying since it gives you more openings to proc passive if you haven't gotten to the third hit yet. Something very important you need to start using in your games will be the buffering capabilities of your E. Whilst your E is a great tool to space and damage enemies, you can also buffer it, which means that if an incoming CC ability such as Camille E or Blitzcrank Hook is about to hit you, if you use it just as it's about to hit you, you neutralize their ability. This is extremely important, and knowing when you can utilize it will be significant. Now on to the W ability. Mastering it will open up a whole new realm, no pun intended, of possibilities. There's a bunch of things you can do with your W ability. The most common and effective one will for sure be jumping in one direction and moving to a different one, as you can see on the screen now. It's very effective and you can do a lot of cool things with it. It's also pretty similar to how Vayne's invisibility mechanic works with Tumble, but the core difference is instead of jumping in the direction you're juking instantly like in her case, you first need to jump in a direction to bait the enemies to move towards it and then quickly move to a different one. Other stunts you can pull off with WR, use it to create or close out space between you and someone else, so basically use the movement speed to chase down or run away from enemies. Use it as an ult extension, so follow up your W ability with an instant ult. It's very helpful since that's sometimes the needed extra space you need to catch up to someone. Last but not least, use it to make picks in the middle late game. W is a great tool to catch people off guard, and you need to use it especially if your ult is on cooldown. The alternative method is to wait for people to come to you in fog of war or bushes, but obviously that's not always possible, so closing distance quickly using W and nuking down with Q and E, or maybe ult if you have it, is needed. Also, putting points in it increases your invisibility duration, meaning that after level 13 when you've maxed out your damage from your other abilities, you'll mainly be gaining utility from putting points in W, but that's not bad at all. It helps you find opportunities that you otherwise might not be able to. And lastly, it's time to talk about the ult. Surprisingly, even though it's the most complex ability of Aurora, there's not much to talk about it since it mainly comes down to the user and how they want to use it. There are some general guidelines that you can use though when making plays with it. 1. It's a great tool to catch people off guard and force 1v1s. Second, it's a great engage tool, but also a great follow-up tool. So make sure you acknowledge what you need to be doing based on your team comp. Let's look at an example. Let's say you have good frontline like in this picture. In this case, you don't need to be engaging too much, unless obviously there's a very good engage angle, but rather you need to let your team do it and you follow up the engage on the correct, more important targets. Now let's look at this picture. In this case, you don't have great engage or frontline from your team, in which case you need to go a more utility focused build after your initial item with items like Zonius, and look to set up your team for success. That said, remember that you're still a squishy carry. So after the initial engage, if possible, look to reposition and be ready to re-engage with your W once it's back up. And the third advice I would like to give you is use the ult to catch up to people by casting it and going through the back wall. Depending on the situation, you might want to do it, but not always. It really comes down to the situation itself. For instance, as shown currently against Garen, I'm sure I want to follow up the initiation, so I took the wall. But let's say I wanted to keep the distance between me and him, I wouldn't take it. Rather, I'd keep the current position and look to play it as it is. A reason for that would be if I'm not sure if I win if I go straight into him, and if I need to outplay him using my mobility and spacing. Last topic that I want to cover is leveling up abilities. The reason I left it for last is since I think it's one of the more interesting aspects about Aurora due to the fact that she's really flexible when it comes to it. Both her Q and E are extremely potent and important abilities, so depending on the matchup, you won't always max the same ability. The general rule of thumb to follow is if the matchup completely outranges you, like for instance Victor or Syndra, or if the matchup is hard to play if you're up close, like if you're facing Cassiopeia or Heimerdinger, you want to put more points into E. Q is always the preferred ability to max out as soon as possible, but for the sake of a healthy laning phase, you'll be forced to put more points into E. Now for the interesting part. On level 3, you will almost always put an extra point in either Q or E, due to W being almost irrelevant unless you're in a hefty situation, such as you're about to get dove under tower or you're getting ganked. This is due to the fact that W doesn't provide much when it comes to trading, since almost every other champion cannot match the damage you put out with your 2 other abilities. On level 4, you're presented with an interesting decision once again, against almost any matchup. Even in bad ones. Do I need to level up my W now or do I put a second point in Q or E, basically the ability that you didn't put a point before? Same as before, you don't need to. Just for clarity, this is how your abilities will look like. There are some games that actually don't put a single point in W until level 8, but that's mostly for top lane. If you're playing mid or ADC Aurora, put a point in W at level 4 or level 5, since you need it due to there being more team-orientated fights. The more of those you think will happen, the sooner you need a point in W. Another reason why on level 4 you rather have 2 points in Q and 2 points in E is because of how much more wave clear you have. It lets you join fights faster or shove out waves faster if you end up killing your opponent. And last but not least, your trading is a lot more potent, since sometimes hitting a Q is hard. It's slower than E, so that extra little bit of damage when you're only able to land E's on your opponent can be crucial. And this is the end of the video. If you made it this far, I appreciate you for taking your time and watching it. It took me a while to make, and I know there will be a new season soon, and some of the things I talked about might be outdated, like the runes and items, but I will be sure to upload more content on Aurora when it does arrive, so subscribe to not miss out.